everybody! Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
I will turn it up in your headphones, Dylan. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy, mind you. We are talking about friend of the show, Mark Lawrence.
Is that what we're doing now? Is it fair to call him? I mean, I'd love to be his friend if he'd like to be mine. I just don't want to speak for him.
He said it was a great listen.
Yeah.
So
maybe
friendly
I'm
towards the show.
That's fair. Maybe I'm like Nona, and I feel like unless you say the word friend to me explicitly, I'm just not sure where we stand.
That's true. I guess you have to consider the possibility that you can just be friends without acknowledging it, Dylan.
Yeah, like how many likes on my tweets does it take before I can start saying Mark Lawrence and I are friends? How many of his tweets do I have to like? These are the questions we're grappling with as we head into our Bound Buddy read.
That's right. We are reading Book of the Ancestor 2.5. It is called Bound. It is a very short story. It is, read it in an afternoon, and we're here to talk about it today.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear what you thought of it, Charles. This was my second time reading it, but it was your first time.
That's right. So we've already dropped the buddy reads for Book of the Ancestor 1 and 2, and I have yet to crack the cover on 3, so I don't know where this series is going or how it ends. Dylan, you have read the series before, so you'll have a couple different perspectives here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and heads up, there will be spoilers for Bound in our Bound Buddy read.
That's right. We will be spoiling Bound, although there's not too much to spoil. You can kind of see how it plays out from about halfway through, but that doesn't make it any less entertaining. So shall we just get right into Bound?
Let's get right into Bound, Charles.
Let's do it. So, the first thing I was like, okay, I wonder why he took the time before like getting into this reading it, right? I was like, I wonder why he took the time to write like such a short story about, the same characters in the same timeline. Like, why not just include it in Book of the Ancestor 3? And as I started, getting through Bound, I was like, oh, well, this is actually kind of a fun little reprieve, if you will. You kind of get more of Nona and her friends. You get more of their teenage girl sides of themselves there. Stealing alcohol, having parties, talking about boys, all these kinds of things. It has a little bit lighter heart of a tone, which the lightest tone I've ever read from a work by Mark Lawrence. I'll say that by a lot.
That is fair, Charles. It's definitely the lightest tone I've read from Mark Lawrence as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with why this fits better as a short story that's 2.5 rather than being the start of book 3, where it takes place in terms of time in between Gray Sister and Holy Sister. But if this was the first part you were reading of the final installment of the Book of the Ancestor trilogy in terms of the full novels, I think you'd be a little confused. Like, is this what this book is going to be about? But it is a total pleasure reading it in the short story format, because we've talked about this, Charles, where we get the hints into this side of Sweet Mercy Convent life when we've been reading the previous installments of this series, but we don't really get the time to just hang out with our characters as they do this more slice of life stuff.
Right.
And while there is certainly a plot going on around this, we do get the time to just see them being teenagers, and it's pretty fun.
Exactly. I mean, when we're reading books 1 and 2, they're this setting of Book of the Ancestor is a very, hardened, unforgiving one. And Nona and the gang have had to go through some very intense stuff. They're fighting, murders, all kinds of plot and intrigue. And it's easy to forget that they're just like middle school children. It's easy to forget that part of their character. And as much as we raved about characterization in books 1 and 2, Mark Lawrence takes a moment with Bounds to put us aside from all of that intense drama and give us another peek at that characterization from the angle of like, here's when they're not like full on fighting the Taxis and like trying to save the ship heart. There's all of these other moments where they're just being friends and being together, and you get to see this like what's Nona doing kind of on her not necessarily downtime, but when she's not like trying to survive, like what is she doing day to day at school. And that was a fun little glimpse into all of their characters that we got to have.
For sure, Charles. It feels like it punches above its weight in terms of rounding out the idea of what it's like to be living at Sweet Mercy Convent. You can start to, when you see how Nona is living her life, and Nona and the gang, as you say,
Mm,
are living their lives prior to getting into like the real plot of the short story. You start to then fill in the gaps where this wasn't happening as much, since the trilogy's main installments focus more on the like meat of what's going on.
right.
You get to be like, oh, so this is pretty much what's happening in between all of that meat. And
Right.
I think, yeah, your mind just fills in that in a way that provides depth to this story and to the characters and their relationships. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I thought it was rather charming. And right off the bat, like one of my first like things that I highlighted was right on page one. It was like mathematics filled her with a dread that a handful of flung throwing stars slicing towards her never could. So one, that's funny because Mark Lawrence has a PhD in mathematics. So to write a character who right off the bat hates math and isn't good at it is very funny. And then two, you're getting this element of like, oh yeah, she'd much rather be, fighting right now. Like she's so much more familiar with that. But now we're taking this moment to like try and solve for X in class. So right off the bat, I was like, oh, this is like a charming little piece right off the bat. So I just thought it was a fun moment to mention right at the top as we kind of go through the plot here.
Yeah, there's that line. She'd never understood why the equations needed her to solve them. Wouldn't they be happier left in peace on the pages of dusty books? Which
Yeah.
is funny thinking that someone who has a PhD in mathematics wrote that, kind of poking fun at himself and his degree, but also giving us how different Nona's perspective is from his own. And I think that's a great point, Charles. This is a theme, I would say, of Bound in some ways, is that Nona is particularly uncomfortable in some of these places that bring about pretty standard teenage social anxiety issues,
Yeah.
like going to your first party, drinking alcohol for the first time, stuff like that is going on, and Nona is super anxious about the whole thing, which makes sense given her age, but it's also in some ways fun to see that normal side of her when at the same time she's someone who has these incredible fighting abilities and has been put in these life-threatening situations constantly. But it's almost like she's way more acquainted with those life-threatening situations than she is with these more standard teenage situations, which is why she feels more fear around the standard teenage situations.
Right. Dodging throwing stars, no problem. Doing math equations, dread. Kissing somebody for the first time, horrible anxiety. So it's like, and confusion. So it's like all these things going on. And yeah, it's just a side to Nona that we get to see in this little a side of a story, which, it definitely definitely makes sense, like you said in the beginning, to separate this as the short story piece, so that we can have this little pause without it detracting from the tone of the main trilogy.
That's for sure, Charles. And I don't want to misportray Bound as something that's all just shenanigans at the convent. There is this whole intrigue bit going on where Ara is brought outside the convent to attend a party, but and there's someone poisoning people amongst the cis, which is the nobility in these books, and they're trying to figure out who it is and try to stop them ideally. But that's all, I think, taking a back seat to spending time with our characters, dealing with these more standard teenage situations, and developing these relationships further, particularly Nona, Ara, and Regal.
Yes, definitely Nona, Ara, and Regal. The book starts with Nona and Ara, though. Nona's first kiss. You know, Ara's like trying to practice kissing for this social party thing, and then it gets, into this moment where they have this first kiss and some kind of magic stuff happens and that thread bonds them. It's an interesting moment worked into this story that is like a huge deal in terms of Nona and Ara's relationship, right? Like to have this context going into book 3 is pretty major. So the fact that there may be these kind of romantic feelings going on between Ara and Nona is kind of a breakthrough here in Bound.
Right. So we've gotten hints that there might be something there in previous books. For example, I think this is in Red Sister, where Apple gives Nona the truth serum and asks her who she's had a crush on,
Yeah, I do
and
remember that.
Nona can't help herself because she's under this truth serum. Says Ara and Regal, and I think she says Kettle too. I can't remember, but she definitely says Ara, and I believe she says Regal. So you get those two characters taking center stage with Nona here, and it does begin with Ara maybe under the guise of I would just want to practice kissing.
Yeah.
Uh, or maybe, who knows? I know where everything's going, so I don't want to give anything away. But they definitely have this moment where Ara takes Nona out under the moon's rays, basically, because
Yeah,
it's like that
the heat
magnifying
of the
glass.
moon like
Yeah,
passes over them, right? Very passionate moment, I would say.
yeah, a very romantic feeling, and then Ara basically just kisses her, and that results in this thread bond that gives the book its name,
Right.
Bound.
And this is Nona's third thread bonding experience at this point, right? With Hessa, Kettle, and now Ara. So it's in line with Nona's character. Like when you're her friend, she's all in. She'll like she's thread bonding with all these people, and Ara's the next one. And this one is interesting because there's these elements of romance that are potentially involved more so than Hessa or Kettle.
Right. Although, if I'm remembering correctly, Nona might have a crush on Kettle, but that is not reciprocated. Kettle is very much taken.
Yes.
So, it's yeah, it's fun to see Mark Lawrence start to flesh out these things that he's dropped some hints about. So, Charles, how are you feeling since you don't know where this all ends up? How are you feeling about the Ara Nona relationship right now?
Right now, I'm feeling pretty good about it. You know, they clearly have the romantic feelings seem to be coming from both sides, and they both seem to be looking out for each other in this series. R's kind of looking out for Nona and trying to keep the spark alive between Nona and Regal, and she's like holding the thread bond tight at the end, right? Not letting Nona kind of escape the thread bond. So it's interesting to see it play out. It still seems kind of like new and confusing and complicated for them. So we'll see where that goes. But I feel like it's kind of like we're still where we left Nona and Ara, but now there's the explicit romantic piece that we didn't have at the end of Grey Sister. So I I'm pretty unchanged, but the romance part definitely adds an element of intrigue to it. But I'm feeling pretty good.
Were you already getting the sense before reading Bound that there might be some romantic feelings there, or even
Not
requited
really. I
romantic
mean, the thing
feelings?
with Nona, she's beyond romantic. Just she's very intense with all of her relationships. She's never really been romantic. I mean, we saw her get a little flustered around Regal, but I mean, with Ara, she's always kind of been pretty confident. I think, um, I guess I always kind of saw the relationship as like, oh, it's one of Nona's early friends, so she has that particular bond with Ara. I wasn't anticipating this romantic piece. So when that scene did play out where they're under like the heat of the moon and everything, I'm like, oh, this is a interesting direction. Like, okay, like let's see where this goes. I'm learning something about Nona that I didn't know she had romantic feelings for Ara really, as much as more of it was like an infatuation with someone who's kind to her.
Yeah, that's interesting, Charles. I think I was in a very similar place to you when I was on my first read through. This read through, I ended up just noticing how frequently Nona refers to what. So we're very tight to Nona's perspective throughout the vast majority of both books, and I take the prose to basically be Nona's perspective on things. I think that's pretty fair.
I agree.
And it's very, very frequent that Ara is described as beautiful
Mm-hmm.
by Nona just throughout. And I think as it's one of the benefits of this third person limited rather than first person narratives that we get where we're in Noah's perspective, but it's also kind of just the narrator. So we're not sure, is this just Lawrence trying to tell us like this is what you're supposed to think about Ara, or is it we're supposed to gather that Nona keeps noticing how beautiful Ara
Yeah,
is?
that's
And
true.
the second read through, I felt like it was a lot more the latter than the former. It's
Oh,
like even when she's talking about what Ara's quote unquote crimes were, when she's saying like, "Oh, Ara's actually not all that bad. A lot of the things I thought were so bad about her were just things Clara said." It's like her crimes were reserved to, in part, being beautiful. So it's like
that's a good
very
point.
frequent.
I guess that's one of the main reasons why I guess I kind of was instinctually. I never thought about it that way, but instinctually, when this moment happened where Nona and Ara kissed, I wasn't like, "What? Now you're gonna make just these two characters kiss for no reason?" Like it did have that moment of honesty about it, in part by how kind of nervous they were and how true to the moment, like two young teens kissing for the first time would be, but
Yeah.
also in that you buy into that there was always this kind of attraction. And that's interesting that you were kind of looking out for that. And it is true. She's always described as beautiful, and we're always so tight to Nona's perspective. And Nona's, always kind of um, felt that way about Aura. So, yeah, I'm with you on that. That's a good observation.
Yeah, it definitely helps knowing where it's going. I don't think I picked up on this as much the first time around, but it's it's interesting too. I've always thought of Kettle, Apple, and Saphira would be the other person as kind of this parallel for Nona, Ara, and Clara in some ways. So Saphira is like the one who
Hmm.
had feelings for Kettle, and I think they did have an actual romantic relationship at one point back when they were
I think they did,
novices.
yeah.
Yes. And then Kettle ends up with Apple. I think Saphira sees it a little bit like Kettle got stolen away by Apple based on the limited time we've gotten with Saphira. And then Saphira's super jealous and ends up kind of
Staying.
betraying them. I
Yeah.
think stabbing Kettle
Yeah.
and then going to be with Sherzal. And
Hmm.
it's similar to some of this stuff that's played out between Clara, Nona, and Ara, especially now that Nona and Ara are starting to develop some of what looks like requited romantic feelings for each other. And Clara always seemed to have romantic feelings toward Nona that were unrequited from everything we could gather.
There is a unique parallel in the relationship triangles there, and I definitely see a lot of similarities between Nona and Kettle for sure, and Saphira and Clara. So, yeah, that's another very good point, sir. You're on top of it today. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was beyond just with these exploration of new relationships, there's also like we get to see more into Nona's vulnerabilities, and about page 30 of this 50-page thing, you start to see Nona being like, oh, she wants to be somebody else, not the uncultured peasant girl with the holy black eyes. And then this line, she wanted to be wanted. So she's you start to see this side of her that I feel like a lot of younger kids feel, of like when they see someone else that's they consider beautiful or popular or whatever, and then you're just so lost in your own insecurities that you're like, man, I just wish I could be someone else, a more confident person that could feel more confident in these social situations, and to have these relationships with other people, and this idea that she wanted to be wanted. And it's a very touching moment that Nona's always kind of had in her character, but when she gets to kind of pause and be in these more casual social situations, it really comes out.
That's a great point, Charles. I think that's core to a lot of what's going on in this story is Nona wanting to be wanted and also wanting to be normal, and that wanting to be wanted bit, it comes up when Regal, who we know Nona has some feelings for too,
Mm-hmm.
and Ara are sorry, not Regal and Ara are not dancing there. It's actually when she's dancing with the antagonist of this thing that I can't remember the name of right now. But there's a line in there where it says she wanted to be the one pressed against that lean body that comes right before she wanted to be wanted. And it's unclear at that moment if she's referring to the person Ara's dancing with, or if she's referring to Ara. And it's kind of, we get this back and forth constantly with Nona throughout this short story where she's like jealous of both Regal and Ara because
Yeah.
they end up like kissing each other uh, for reasons we'll get into.
Yeah, that
And
was an interesting moment.
yeah. And it's like Nona wants to be wanted by both of them. And it's, I don't know, not like really much else I've read to see someone basically in the perspective of someone she has some feelings for
Yeah.
and being jealous of both that person and the person that they are kissing. It's like
Yeah.
interesting stuff that got explored here.
Yeah, there's definitely like, and even Nona struggles with these issues of like, am I like prying on an intimate moment? Is
Yeah.
this weird? Like, and probably it is, but Ara seems cool with it, I suppose. And the name of the antagonist, by the way, is Jordo,
Thank you.
Jordo. You're welcome. So, yeah, before we get too far into what happens next in the plot, there is these moments of like, oh, all of these royal kids are getting poisoned seemingly at random, but it cannot possibly be food or drink because of the tasters. There's tasters and there's fine, and they're fine. And some of these parties don't even serve food or drink. So then that's after that, Ara and Nona talk about kissing, and then you're like, okay, like the threads are coming together here. We have somehow we're spreading poison amongst teenagers without food or drink. So it's like, okay, so I like it's interesting that he's like with only 50 pages, he's starting to put these points in and weave them
Yeah.
together. And that's where we get the master plan of like, okay, um, obviously this guy's like killing girls by kissing them with poison. And one dude, I guess, also got poisoned. And we will, counterattack by attaching a needle to your tongue, and you poke the poison sac with the tongue with your needle tongue, and and poison the poisoner. And you're like, whoa! But it's like, but you need to practice first, and it's like, let's do a couple kissing practice things, and you're like, okay, like this is all happening right now. So that's kind of the that gets us back to these moments of Ara and Jordo together, and then these moments of invading privacy between Ara and what's his name that starts with the R?
Regal.
Regal. Yeah, I'm just like, I think of Regal as the antagonist in Assassin's Apprentice, but it's Regal, not Regol. But still, very different characters, but their name is pronounced the same.
Yeah. And I think, Charles, it sounds like you saw some of this coming, right? There's only so many pages, there's only so many variables, and unlike Nona, you were able to solve for X over here.
I mean, I wasn't. I was highly suspicious that there was, because like in the movie Batman and Robin, where Poison Ivy has she can like kiss people and that kills them, and then Robin has the wax lips, and that's how he like thwarts her. It's like the same thing. She just waxed up the inside of her mouth and did this counter poison, like bubble bursting of the poison in the mouth. But I thought it was fun. I thought it was cute, and it's a fun way to kind of explore teenage romance and also have this like high stakes espionage / action piece worked in. It's like, okay, Ara, you have to kiss a boy. It's like it's the stakes have never been higher for them, because even though they've like fought off royal family and like demon possessed ultra warriors, this is also another one of those super intense dramatic moments for them. So it's kind of cute to see that play out, and I think Mark Lawrence did a good job of balancing like the teenage woes with the actual like devastation and political intrigue going on here.
Right. It leans super hard on that zaniness that we've talked about, Charles, as being it, right? It underlies a lot of what happens in the main installments of the trilogy, when they put Yisht in a barrel or whatever, and it starts to
they put
feel
Yisht
like
in a barrel.
It starts to be like, oh my god, I can't believe this is a bunch of middle-aged girls putting Yisht in a barrel.
They
makes
put
sense
Yisht
with
in
that.
a barrel.
That would be like the silly plan a bunch of, at that point, 12-year-olds would come up with. But it's leaning completely in on that side and pretty much doing away with focus on the darker, grittier sides of the trilogy. And I think it benefits a lot from having the space to just spend 49 pages on pure zaniness and silliness. And these are fun characters to spend time with, and we appreciate even more when we get to spend time with them in a setting that's low stakes like this. Or even though it is still life and death, it never feels like it.
I agree totally. And as zany as it is, and it is zany, there are these moments towards the end that you read and you're like, okay, we're learning some more cautionary tale kind of stuff here. And there is this almost very light warning that I kind of walked away with at the end of this book, and that is like, is Nona kind of overextending herself with how intense she gets about her relationships? Like you could make the case that Nona getting involved with Ara's head was kind
That's
of
some interesting fan fiction you got going there, Charles. Nona and Arya,
yeah,
somewhat similar characters.
somewhat similar for sure.
Yeah,
They both have these, violent tendencies, and they make use of the shadows and all this other stuff. This idea of getting trained and by a bunch of
yeah.
intense weirdos. But yes. What was I saying? So yeah, this idea that Nona, you could make the case that maybe Nona got too involved, and like she should have maybe sat this one out. Like Kettle and Glass, they sought out Ara for this mission, and then once Nona gets involved, she like can't let it go. She's like, I have to keep being with Ara. I have to keep seeing what she's seeing, and then we get to the point where she kind of blows the mission and knees Jordo in the groin at that moment, right? It's supposed to be a stealth mission. It's like leak the poison and walk away, and then Nona kind of panics and takes over Ara's body for a quick moment to get this jolting knee to the groin, and you do kind of like buy it, but again, like you brought up, we're so close to Nona's perspective. How much of it was Nona being like, "Oh my God, he's going to attack! It's happening! Do something!" And how much of it could have just been, all going according to plan? And that is, an interesting piece to this. And then, of course, the mission was blown, and they had to like kill a bunch of people, and they almost died, and they did eventually escape. But there is this interesting piece to Nona that she might be potentially too intense with how involved she is with her friendships and her relationships. And although that's not too explored in this book, it does present some of the warning signs in this book. And that's one of the pieces that I walked away with here.
That's all said, Charles, and I think we pretty much get to see this for the double-edged sword that it is. And Nona's investment, her relationships has always been pretty much her biggest strength and her biggest weakness in some ways. And I think we also get it as a strength when she headbutts. What was it, Jordo? Is his
Yeah,
name?
Jordo.
Yeah. So she headbutts Jordo, basically takes over Ara's body and makes her headbutt Jordo because Jordo's trying to kiss her. And that might have been a little bit more jealousy or
Right.
coming in than anything else.
I'd say
But
so.
that leads to the reveal that he had been trying to poison her. So she saves Ara's life because of her intense investment, but she also then endangers her because of her intense investment. So I think the warning is well founded, but there's also a lot of positives as we've seen to Nona's
That's true. I
intensity of
mean, her
relationships.
investigative team back at the convent did a good job of being like, look, this is totally random. So perhaps they're just trying to draw out the sisters, and then that's when Nona made the connection, and she was able to transfer the message. So that was all pretty crucial to the success of this mission. I'll give you that. But, there always seems to be these, like, how many times have the nuns warned Nona of her, like, doing this unreciprocated over concern for friends? It's like, let Clara worry about herself, Nona. She's totally fine. And now it's like she's intervening on Ara's behalf in these moments where she's feeling not necessarily like the mission's at stake, but that she's kind of like jealous or maybe insecure about watching Ara, have relationships with other people. So I don't know. It's very interesting.
It is interesting, Charles, and you mentioned Clara there, and we do get a Clara cameo is probably the best way to phrase it here, where Clara's just kind of at the party and she sees Ara and gives a little shooing motion is all we
Yes.
get.
It's like,
And it's so interesting. This use of perspective is, I think, one of Lawrence's greatest strengths, like throughout the book of the Ancestor. And we hear from Nona's perspective, that is perceived as, oh, she was warning Ara and saying like, get out of here, Ara, they might be trying to kill you, which actually ends up, we don't know what Claire's motivation was, but actually if it was that, then
Yeah, she could
that would
have like
be,
the most popular going theory right now is that she was being like, leave, you're in danger, because she must have been
yes,
in on the Joro plot, right?
it
So
makes sense because she's got affiliations with the Taxis is.
yes,
And so, yeah, maybe she was doing that, or maybe she just doesn't like Ara and she was like, get out of here. What are you even doing here? Go back to the convent. And
that's
that's,
also yeah.
yeah, that's how Nona's friends back home were interpreted. Like, Ruli thinks that it's actually like Clara who's the killer, and she tells Nona that like you've always been blind, you're just blind where Clara is concerned, you always have been. She sold you down the river, sold all of us. So it's
Understandable.
interesting. We get another one of those warnings from someone close to Nona. Hey, you still have this thing where you see her as good as you possibly could see her, like as charitable as possible, but maybe you shouldn't be doing that. So I think it's still mixed. Like, do we know? Should we be taking a warning away, or should we be feeling good about Nona's investment in her relationships?
That's true, and only time will tell. But it certainly seems to be her strength as well as her weakness sometimes. Um, and yeah, we see her more of committing to the path. Her this again, this theme of like, forget what anyone has ever taught me about being delicate with the path. I'm just using my rage to get the motivation to charge into the path, and that's still working for her, and it's going well. But it's still kind of troubling to see that she needs to feel this like rage in order to draw on her strength, but she ends up in team with Ara and Regal saving the day. Kettle was a little bit distracted somewhere, I guess. She hasn't really been able to protect these novices at any point. Like back when they went ranging in Red Sister, and
Poor Kettle.
yeah, I know. They should maybe send two nuns next time. Like instead of just
Well,
Kettle, like
Pot
maybe.
was in the mix.
Yeah, I guess. That
We
was
get the
funny. Where it's
sense
like pot
Pot,
meet
yeah,
kettle. I was like, ah,
yeah,
ha, ha, ha.
right. But Pot doesn't have any of these abilities from what we can gather.
And Pot did not call the kettle black either. I was like, oh, I don't know how she would have. Like, there's nothing about the color black that weaves into maybe like a shadow reference or something. But no, we didn't get it.
Yeah, I think we're okay with without that moment. But I I do want to talk about some of these moments between Regal and Ara,
Mm-hmm.
where they basically have no chemistry,
Right.
despite it's like Regal, we can tell, is very into Nona. That's been obvious for a while here. And Nona has trouble believing that, especially when it's couched in this idea that he's like kissing Ara,
Yeah.
who Nona sees as extremely beautiful, but he is more interested in Nona, who she perceives herself as you mentioned, Charles, this fully black-eyed peasant girl. Like, how could you desire me
Right.
instead of with Ara right in front of you?
Yeah, and those were interesting moments too. It also kind of um, keeps the romantic situation in check. Nona can be interested in both Ara and Regal without them like going off and doing their own thing. So that was interesting, and then that adds to these moments where Nona's in Ara's like thread bound to Ara in Ara's head. Ara's kissing Regal. Ara's forcing Nona to like be complicit in the in
Yeah.
the kissing, and it's like because in the narrative it's written like, oh, Ara wouldn't let her go, and I was like, oh,
Hmm.
he wants to kiss you anyway, so you should stick around for this or whatever. And then Nona's kind of trying to process it, and Regal's just like going along with whatever. He's like, okay, I'm here to serve.
Right. It's a weird moment. It definitely feels like the kind of early teenage shenanigans
Yeah,
that I imagine
and
if you
Kettle's
had
like,
these
well, now you have
powers.
to practice kissing. Let's go. You're
Yeah.
like, okay, it's interesting.
And I have some quotes I highlighted now that I actually read this on a Kindle. I can
Nice,
do these
nice.
highlighting because that's the only way it's available here. Um, it's faced with the golden Arabella Jotsis, wrapped tight in flowing silks. No boy on Abath would be wishing for the scruffy, night-eyed novice back in the convent. And there's also some interesting lines here where we're hearing about like Nona not knowing who she's more jealous of here. It's like we're still caught between the two parties. She wasn't sure which side of the equation she wanted to be on. I believe that's when Regal and Ara are kissing. And
Yeah,
then
and again with this theme of like math references, which also is how this book ends, by the way.
true.
Starts with a math
Yeah.
reference, you're dropping a few now, and then it ends with Nona is X in the equation, which
Well,
I was still trying to figure out what that means, but
there's also a chemistry reference, Charles. The lack of
that's
chemistry between the pair both pleased and surprised her when Nona's speculating on
right.
Regal and Ara just not working for whatever reason. Two
Yeah,
good looking folks, but just not happening.
that's right. And there's that interesting moment where Nona kind of explains why she likes Regal. And it's Regal with his outward charm and inward nerves, his violence and his vulnerability. And I think that's kind of Nona almost projecting her own balance of violence and vulnerability of like she is a very capable violent warrior, but she's also very sensitive and vulnerable when it comes to having a relationship with someone, because relationships are so sacred to her that she makes herself vulnerable by jumping all in. And then I guess that's why she kind of connects with Regal in a way. That and they both were of the cage, right? Regal's like my
Hmm.
sister of the cage.
Yes. Good old Gil John's cage. A lot of strong bonds formed there, Charles. So we have some interesting moments as we start moving toward the end here, Charles, where following Nona kicking Jordo in the groin and getting him to swallow the poison
Uh
after Ara popped the poison sac in his mouth.
huh.
Then pretty much the shoot hits the fan, keeping the clean rating and saying the
Yeah.
same thing I said in our Gray Sister episode.
Yeah.
And
Who could forget?
we end up in a situation where Ara and Regal are taking on just a bunch of Gerrans, which are the really big people, I guess.
Yes, they are big.
Yeah, they're like 7 feet tall if they have Gerran blood, at least 7 feet tall. And they're fighting a bunch of them, and things start seeming like they're going to go awry potentially. And Nona has to use her angry path walking and like sending that through the bond to help out Ara and Regal. Ara and Regal end up getting out of there. It's a interesting little fight scene in the middle of this shenanigan filled short
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, they're fighting all these troops, but then she needs Nona to walk the path, and we that's one of the things we learned about thread bonding and path walking is like, well, if Nona walks the path, but while she's thread bound to Ara, like what happens? And I guess it's kind of like both bodies get benefits of path energy, I suppose, which is an interesting development that I guess we didn't know before.
Nona's just like shot out as light back on her end, and she's like, "Oh no, I need that.
Yeah,
Like, can't be using that up here."
you're right.
So then, I mean, the fight scene's a Lawrence fight scene. It's well written, all that kind of stuff, but nothing super in need of deep covering here. What I do want to discuss is the moment where Ara confronts Regal a little bit toward the end, where she says, "That's right, we have a bond, Nona and I." And in the
Uh,
prose, there's something in the way she said it to him, something Nona caught in the tone of her voice. A challenge? A warning? Was Ara protecting her? I'm wondering how you read that one, Charles. I'm
I
happy to
read it
say
a
how I did.
couple ways. The main takeaway the theory that I'm subscribed to is she's like, we have a bond, and if you do anything to hurt her, I'm coming for you, kind of a thing, like a protective thing. Like kind of friends do. It's like, if you hurt her, you're going to you have to answer to me, that kind of a
Hmm.
thing. Like when he said, protect, like, is she protecting her? That's kind of the theory I walked away with, because she seemed pretty on board with the Nona Regal matchup. So I don't know why in this moment she would be like, she's all mine. So I just think it's like, don't you hurt her kind of a situation. Which in Nona's case is a very good piece of advice. Like, you definitely don't want to betray Nona's affections.
Right. I think you covered the two main ways I would say to read this, and I won't speculate too much because I know where all of this is going. But you can either read it as like, don't you hurt her, or you could read it as you stay away from her because Nona and I have a bond and you're just some like
Mm-hmm.
nobody who hardly knows her. So I think it's another great use of the medium of a text rather than a show or a movie or whatever where you'd have to actually hear what words she emphasizes and stuff like that.
Right. And the tone of the voice and everything like
Right.
that. And
Because there's like, we have a bond, Nona and I. Or there's like, we have a bond, Nona and I. It's like, those are two very different ways
it's
of
all about the
delivering that.
implication.
Yeah. So it's hard to know, and Lawrence seems very aware that he wants you to know how Nona's kind of perceiving it while leaving it open for it could have been either way. And Nona doesn't tend to have the best read on other people.
No, she does not. And we are so tightly wound in her perspective that we have to consider both possibilities at this point. And that's
You
how
might
this
say
book.
tightly bound to it.
That's right, tightly bound.
Heyo.
And ayo, that's why you got to follow us on Twitter, man. All of these kind of goodies, and the FTF podcast with the number one at the end on Twitter. And yeah, the other like ominous thing that we get is reminding us of the Taxus threat. That it's like, yes, he will go this far just for the chance of drawing out someone that Nona potentially likes, so that they can kill her, So it's like she's not safe by any means, and no one she loves is safe. And we know with Nona that her relationships are even more sacred than her own well-being in many cases. So to her, that's like the ultimate threat, because they go back to like, oh, Taxus threatened to cut me into pieces, and at the time it was like, I'm gonna
Yes. I have the
literally
quote,
cut you to
Charles.
pieces. Yeah, go ahead.
He said he would cut pieces off me, and what was Ara if not a piece of her heart? Just so charming.
Very charming and very sweet. And also, like, I think Nona would rather have you chop her,
Yes.
pieces of her body off than harm Ara. So,
Hmm.
um, I mean, she went out of her way. She took the challenge of the shield to protect Abbas Glass. So imagine what she would do to protect Ara. And
Right.
so that's just kind of the last ominous piece where Book of the Ancestor 2.5, kind of that flavor it leaves in your mouth as you go to pick up book 3. So it's very interesting.
It is interesting indeed, Charles. Well, the last line we're left with here is along those lines you were mentioning with the math bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Abyss Glass will just have to factor it into her equations. X is Nona Gray, and nobody knows what that is. We get that line. And I know you had some thoughts, it sounded like, about that.
I had to read it a couple times. I was like, X is Nona Gray, and no one knows what that is. So I guess it's like no one knows the role Nona's going to play in this greater calamity, or no one knows what Nona's involvement is in all this, or what she's capable of, or what she's going to do next, or what. Just the general mystery. I don't know. What did you take away from that line?
I also read it multiple times, but I think I kind of started just reveling in the uncertainty of it as like that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah,
It's like you named all of these things, and it's like which one of it do we not know? It's like, well, we don't know any of them. That's why it's this variable that nobody knows what it is.
right.
So I think to take it as yes and when you're speculating on all of those different what could it be? We
Right. I guess she's
we
just like, I don't know what
also
to do with this Nona, with this Nona girl. I really don't.
yes. And there's also the last bit which reminds me of all of these kettle Kettle's class versus Nona's class parallels where Kettle finishes it with the last line is, and it's not like I don't know how much trouble one little kiss can lead to.
And when I read this again just now while you were reading it, and I'm thinking back to the beginning of this episode when you were talking about the parallels, I'm like, yeah, cool. I'm sure she's alluding to the one kiss she had with Glass, maybe that she betrayed Saida, or vice versa.
You mean with Apple?
Oh yeah, with
But more
Apple.
good fan fiction ideas that you're coming up with here, Charles. You're the master of that.
What can I
Um,
say? My it's as the psych people say, a Freudian maybe.
Freudian slip.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's definitely a little bit of knowing from Kettle, and it's a good use of characterization. It reminds me of like certain, you know, like cool dramatic TV shows like Heroes or Lost, where you have these like ominous kind of threads that just make you more interested in the character. So Kettle says these moments of like, it's not like I don't know how much trouble one kiss can get into, and you're like, there's a story there. That sounds very interesting, Kettle. And we've, Lawrence has built up this kind of love triangle backstory between, Kettle and Seda and Apple.
You Kettle and Saphira. Seda
Saphira.
was the was
I'm
the
all over the
kid
place.
that got hanged.
Oh,
In her
yeah,
sister.
yeah. Oops. So, yeah. So Mark Lawrence keeps the mystery alive. He gives us just enough to know, to kind of get the idea of what she's talking about, but then still keeps the mystery alive, where it's like, that's kind of fun.
Right, Charles. And we know from previous books here that when people get threadbound, we expect that there is some sort of like cosmic tying of their destinies in some ways. It's not necessarily in those words, but that their paths, if you will tend to mirror each other. We got that with actually Hessa and Nona was where Nona was originally told that that's a thing that happens, and Nona was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like, but it would make sense if Kettle and Nona, as people who have been threadbound here, are following some similar paths. We don't know to what extent that will end up happening,
Right.
but
And
we'll
there's the
save that
greater
for Holy
arching
Sister.
theme of how intimacy plays a role in these greater politics, right? Like whose side is on whose stems a lot from the relationship they had as, what would be seemingly these innocent teenage relationships play a huge factor in these flash forwards that we've gotten so far in Book of the Ancestor. So it's like one little kiss, right? Or like, oh, one friendship or one act of intimacy is now snowballed into this, you're on one side of the war and I'm on the other and I'm impaling you with a spear. So it's like, she's kind of alluding to that of like what one kiss can do. It's like, well, here's what, we also know someone else in the story that had one kiss. And it's just all ominous, getting you all pumped for book 3.
And I am pumped for book 3. And Charles, I'm realizing we're probably close to talking about this book for as long as it takes to actually read it.
Yeah,
So maybe
we
that's
are.
a decent sign that we ought to uh, wind things down over here. And if you get that outro music playing, I can start to tell people where they can reach us, as you
You
mentioned.
got it. Here it comes.
Nice. As you mentioned earlier, you can reach us on Twitter. Find us at the FDF Podcast 1 over there. You can also find us on Facebook or Instagram at the FDF Podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes to send emails to your podcasts of choice, then you can reach us at the FDF Podcast at gmail.com. And I'll find it. I will send you a response.
That's true.
But Twitter is probably a better place, or Insta really, than email if you want a quick response. And then, yeah, if you're really enjoying this and you just so happen to be on Apple Podcasts, that's the corporation, not Sister Apple, well, then you can toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, guys.
We really appreciate it whenever anyone does that. Like, I text Charles immediately. I'm like, dude, someone toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Woo-hoo. It's always nice to see that number go up. And we're at like, what, 6 or something? 7. So it's like, hey, one more would be a huge deal. So be part of those good vibes, man. Toss 5 stars if you like what you're hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thanks for listening, everybody. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.